Oh. Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies Podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my guest today is.
Dr. Wesley Stevens. I'm someone who loves studying and exploring social media, digital culture, visual cultures as well, but I always look at those things with a mind toward race, identity, thinking about the kinds of logics and systems that are embedded in those platforms. But that's just a long way of saying I'm very much an identity and social media scholar.
Great. I'm looking forward to talking to you about that. Before we get on to that, I want to say hello to the little dog behind you, your new little pooch that you guys have adopted. Wonderful. You told me about before we started recording. Welcome her to your life together,
Yes, our little Rosie.
Rosie. And then to pose to you, muchísimas gracias, ¿vale? Sí. The question that I put to everybody, which is muy amable, gracias. What's currently dynamizing, preoccupying, interesting, impeding you? What's going on for Doc Stevens?
I'd probably have to say, well, the first thing that comes to mind is I've been writing fantasy novels on the side for the last couple of years, in addition to my academic job. And that is where I kind of, let my creative juices flow. That's a process that's very therapeutic and cathartic for me. It's something where I am interested in pursuing publication at some point in the future, but for now, it's just something that has been an integral part of my life for so long that I actually don't talk about very much. So, but that's the first thing that comes to mind when you ask that question is my creative writing, my fantasy writing, reading, kind of workshopping as trilogy that I've been working on. And I'm very pleased with the with the state of it. We'll see what happens in the future, but just with some other kinds of things that are also preoccupying my mind or my time, that's where I love to spend my time is creative writing.
You know, I have a grown-up daughter and a 10-year-old daughter, and the 10-year-old reads young adult fiction. She loves those trilogies. So when it gets published, she'll be lining up and she likes books, like real books, physical material things. We're
Yes.
delighted about this, right? To be
Yes.
around with a 10-year-old reading books, I just can't believe it. I don't read books. I mean, I read them, on my little telephone. She wants the real McCoy. Can you tell us a bit more about not necessarily giving the scoop to the secret to what goes on in your fantasy fiction, but about the genre and what draws you to it as a creative person?
Sure. As a genre, fantasy is the genre I'm writing in. Most of what I write is adult fiction as opposed to young adult specifically, but I have loved fantasy my entire life. Like when I think back to my childhood and some of my earliest memories, I think about my mom showing me The Dark Crystal, watching Labyrinth with her, specifically 80s dark fantasy is where like very foundational in my childhood, things like Legend, things like Willow. So that has just been kind of a mainstay, something that was ever present for me. And my mom, I remember her being so excited when the Lord of the Rings movies came out. We waited, that was in the early 2000s. We waited for them to become available on DVD so we could buy them and then watch them all at one time. And that is like a core childhood memory is when we were able to actually buy all of the DVDs and take one whole weekend and watch all of them. And so I've always loved fantasy. I've always loved creativity. I also really love things like D&D, Dungeons and Dragons, tabletop role-playing games. I also used to do musical theater as well, if that kind of speaks to kind of the performative creative aspects of why I'm interested in tabletop role-playing and things like D&D as well. I just find those things so fun. And even with video games that I play now, things like Skyrim or Baldur's Gate and many others, I just find fantasy can take place in so many different environments. It can spotlight so many different, very fundamentally human issues, conditions, and experiences. And I just love it's in the name, the fantastical nature. I love when there's magic. I love when there's things that can only exist in your imagination that you've conjured up and that you'd like to share with the world and with other people. And at least for the fantasy stories I really gravitate toward, they usually really have something fundamentally human, personal, and emotional at the core of it. And I find that that's something that really informs my writing now, that a lot of what I do in my own fantasy writing really explores complicated questions of growth, change, morality, how best to honor people who came before you, how you kind of find your own path within that context. And really, I find that a lot of my stories are driven by a really emotional core.
That's interesting. I'm thinking about a slightly different but related genre, I guess, sci-fi.
Mm-hmm.
How over the last century, it's often been a place for feminist utopias, right, at a
Yeah.
very profound level, and perhaps a bit more recently also for Black utopias in the United States, where
Mm-hmm.
these have been areas, and often queer identities too, more recently, I think, that these related genres provide opportunities for thinking beyond the everyday, but using the everyday. Is that reasonable, do you think, as an account?
I think so. I actually really appreciate how you phrased it by thinking about things that are definitely out of the ordinary, fantastical, but they are carrying some element of truth or lived experience, or as you said, the everyday with them, that there's still something recognizable in these stories and these characters, their experiences, or how you've described fantasy being a space for, and sci-fi as well, being a space for kind of feminist utopias or Black utopias, or to explore Afrofuturism, or just to explore somebody's um, unique personal experience that is certainly shaped by the other kinds of identity factors that just shape their lives.
Yeah. When you mentioned social media, I always say so-called social media because often it's antisocial. I think we'd have
Mm-hmm.
to admit. And I keep being told by journalists, scholars, opinion makers, influencers that the old-fashioned media don't matter and social media are everything. But the latest data worldwide show there's a downturn in young people's use of social media. And when I ask young people about this, they say, yeah, that's right. I'm more interested in meeting my friends. I'm more interested in working out. I like watching television. I like reading.
Yes.
I'm fascinated by this sort of dynamic, this view that old people don't understand social media, but, they dominate Facebook.
Mhm.
But TikTok and Instagram are where it's at. Now, interestingly, I mentioned my younger daughter buying these books, or I'm not sure she pays for them all, Doc, but whatever, getting these books. And she gets tips on the latest books through reviews on Pinterest, which last I looked was fashion and makeup, but it's books as well. So this is a very long prolegation into asking of you, what's the story right now, as far as you can see, with social media use for young people, for your students, for others etc. Do you see what I'm getting at?
Yes, and this is something, honestly, to your first question you asked about what is preoccupying my mind right now, and it is actually seeing younger generation's relationship to social media. And I have been teaching a social media class at my current university almost every single semester, so fall, summer, or fall, spring, and summer sessions for the last 4 or 5 years or so. And it's been really interesting to see in this class, which is called Social Media and Society, one of our foundational courses for our social media minor, that over the years I start to see trends and patterns or how things change. And that's just at my current university. I also taught at two universities before then, so kind of a more broad mapping over the last decade or so. And I've certainly seen what you have found to be true in terms of younger generations, especially currently right now, I have a lot of students in my classrooms who, when we go to do certain kinds of assignments or they're going to social media for exercises that I'm having them do, there are a lot more students who either intentionally don't have social media. They said, you know what, I used to have it, I deleted it. It was negatively impacting my mental and emotional well-being. I found that I was engaging in higher degrees of social comparison or like FOMO, like fear of missing out and seeing other people's lives and other people's highlight reels, or a lot of them right now. I'm in the United States and we're thinking about our current I'm not really sure exactly what word to use, but our current the current political climate of the nation as it stands right now in 2026. I have a lot of students who are also really critical and skeptical about AI and misinformation and political polarization on these platforms and how what we see on social media is not a mirror for what society thinks. It's often, if we're thinking about platform algorithms, how they're architected, how personalization works on many of these social media platforms, you're seeing a very skewed version of opinions, or you're seeing the loudest people in the room, so to speak, but in a digital platform. So, whose content, whose opinion is gaining the most traction, even if it's rage bait or if it's inflammatory or it's meant to kind of um, farm engagement, get those clicks and engagement without really any care or intentionality for how is this contributing to larger cultural discourse. And so I do see these younger generations of people, students, of citizens that are either choosing to disengage, say, you know, I deleted my Instagram, I deleted my TikTok, or I take consistent breaks. Well, I'll, you know, yes, I have TikTok, but I'll try to go a few days at a time without using it or without opening it because I know these students, these younger generations of people that have grown up as digital natives have this reflexive awareness that even if they can't put a language to it or a
Right.
specific word or term or concept, they can still very much recognize, I feel bad after I've just spent 5 hours doom scrolling. I feel worse about myself, my how I look, what my life is like after seeing what these creators and influencers are doing with their lives or where they live or trips that they're going on. So there is that level of awareness that what I see on social media is simultaneously not doesn't seem to be an accurate reflection of what the people in my life think about issues that I encounter on social media are actually like, and also just how it impacts us psychologically, mentally, emotionally, cognitively as well.
All those things. And right now, of course, we're being, I was about to say bombarded, which is an
Mm.
unfortunate choice of words, but we are being bombarded with bizarre artificial intelligence style social media posts from the White House,
Mhm.
horrific information in inverted commas, fiction, about what's happening in Iran and elsewhere without gaining copyright endorsement, melding together things from Hollywood with so-called real footage.
Right.
This to me is very terrifying. Hola, ¿qué tal? But part of the issue also is that when I regularly taught in the US and I would ask students about their worries over surveillance through social media, they would refer to anxiety about the state engaging in surveillance. But nowadays, they're talking more, and so are students here in Mexico, about corporate surveillance, about your preferences, your interests becoming known. And I wanted to tie that into a really important article of yours, blackfishing on Instagram, because there's something there about what's gone on really for almost a century, which is fashionistas spying on or drawing ideas from Black culture in the United States, be it music or clothing, or, pardon me, a style of some kind. So I wondered if you could comment on that while I quietly cough with the microphone off.
Okay. Yes, that's interesting framing it in the context of surveillance. I think in the article, some of the framing and the language that I use relies more heavily on extractivist logics or this idea of logics in general, the fact that kind of my starting point for thinking about social media is that technology is not neutral. Again, if we think about algorithms, personalized recommendations, the fact that platforms are often designed in a way that are meant to keep you scrolling and engaged for longer periods of time. So if we think about features like the fact that you can endlessly scroll, whereas earlier in social media's history, it used to be chronological, and once you saw the post from the people you'd followed, that was kind of it for your feed for the day. Those days are we're in a different moment right now. And so I think a lot about, okay, these platforms, these digital tools and technologies are built in a way that incentivize engagement. And depending on the platform, they carry unique affordances. So affordances is generally just what does the platform encourage you to do, or what does it suggest its optimal use is? So if you think about Instagram, classic version of Instagram that kind of started as like a digital scrapbook almost, where people would post pictures of family and trips and things like that. It's all architected around the visual, around the image. So Instagram is a very visual platform in a way that Twitter/X has historically not been. So I always think about, okay, in the platform design, in the algorithms, in the community guidelines, in the features, and how the features are designed to work, what does it encourage you to do? And Instagram, as we know it now, is much more curated, a much more heavily branded space. You see a lot of influencers who use Instagram to publish pictures from photo shoots or branded or corporate events that they've attended, whereas maybe their TikTok presence is a little bit more raw or unfiltered. They're a little bit more casual. It feels behind the scenes. And so I usually start with this kind of analysis from that starting point of thinking about platforms, that these platforms themselves are embedded with competitive logics, visual logics, capitalist logics that incentivize production, cultural production through making posts, or through, if we're thinking about Instagram, visually and aesthetically appealing images as well. And if we're thinking about how for many influencers, particularly in the beauty space, are just disproportionately female, then what does it mean when you have a creator or an influencer who is working on Instagram, who is trying to accrue or attract more followers, is trying to, kind of increase their odds of showing up higher in feeds or in an algorithmic search? How do they maximize what they can do with visual imagery? And so that history sits right alongside a much longer history of cultural appropriation from Black communities, especially in countries like the United States, for instance, which has a very uniquely race and gendered history of chattel slavery, and just these already very extractivist policies, legislation, and practices. What happens when that socio-historic context kind of collides with what's happening on digital platforms, and we end up in a situation where you have non-Black women who on Instagram and on very visual platforms are then styling themselves in ways that they look Black or racially ambiguous, and then kind of connecting that to what we see in celebrity culture, thinking about Kim Kardashian, or thinking about historically Ariana Grande before her Glinda transformation that everybody points to, that she looked, sounded, spoke quite differently than she does since she's been associated with Glinda in the Wicked franchise now, in the adaptation. And so that's kind of my starting point for thinking about. It's really interesting that you mentioned surveillance in the context of that, because to engage in that extractivist practice where you mine a community or a culture for, here's what we find attractive. We find these physical features attractive. We're going to borrow them, or we're going to, adopt or alter our own bodies, either physically or digitally, to imitate that kind of form, even though historically you've been on the receiving end of discrimination, discriminatory practices, and a lot of a horrible, nasty rhetoric about the Black feminine body, which is simultaneously othered and exoticized, but also fetishized in some really gross ways. Thinking about surveillance in that context, if we're thinking about social media platforms and just how normalized it's become to share information about yourself, or how normal it feels that, okay, well, if I want to use this platform, I have to agree to the terms and conditions. I just have to accept the fact that they're going to be tracking my movements, or they're going to be tracking it from app to app or website to website. And then if, it's almost this kind of veil of consent in a way, consent in quotes, because not exactly true consent, but it's just become so normal what we share about ourselves online, the fact that we do share or post about here's where I'm going on vacation, here are my preferences about this, or just the fact that it's architected into these platforms to be able to collect data from um, other apps, websites, other kinds of platforms, and then use that information to then give us more targeted ads or to just kind of further curate our feeds. Kind of my thoughts in your characterization of this as surveillance is just how normal it has become. And kind of to the point earlier in our conversation, I do see younger generations of people, of students who are pushing back on the fact that those things are normal, that is it really that normal to have an entity or a corporate platform or a company track what you do across websites, across apps, or kind of use that data. The bigger thing that I usually talk about in my classes, use that data and then run analytic insights on the data to draw inferences about, well, based on this video you watched, based on this ad that you did pause and look at, based on all this data we've collected, you can then run some further analytics to see, okay, we think you're likely someone that has difficulty sleeping at night because of this activity we viewed on your phone. Or we think you're likely someone whose body mass index is of this percentage. We're going to start showing you more diet pills and things of that nature for ads. That how is that information used once it's been extracted? There's a lot you can do that goes beyond just having access to each individual piece of information about someone. It's really in the analytic insights that you can draw from that data and how you use that that kind of shapes this terrain in a sense.
Absolutely. Apologies, Prof, for coughing earlier. I had throat surgery 4 or 5 weeks ago, and I'm much better, but every now and then the scars in my throat take over, I think. You know what I mean? So, yes, I hear what you're saying. I think that's very important. And there's something interesting in this odd oscillation, this strange dialectic of white supremacy and desire for blackness, right?
Mhm.
And I think back to when I was a child and white people like me started getting Afro style hairdos. That this was a very big thing in the late 60s, early 70s, as an example. And of course, there are many, many, many others. This desire to be that which you're not, even as what you are, grants you all kinds of advantages versus the person you're mimicking. It's a very odd dynamic. I think it applies in many other countries as well. And further to that, I wanted to inquire about blackfishing in particular, because I must admit, until I read your article, I actually didn't know this word.
Oh,
So, pardon my ignorance. Let me guess that some listeners may share it. Could you give us a basic account of that explanation?
sure. So blackfishing is essentially a portmanteau or a kind of combination of two words that already exist. We're thinking about the word catfishing. So catfishing when, if we're thinking about kind of classic or traditional catfishing in digital and online context, or we think about it in terms of online dating, or even the MTV show Catfish that explores these dynamics. Catfishing is when you portray yourself as someone other than what you are, usually in a digital context, though not always. Very often it's associated with online dating or online relationships where you meet online and your profile picture might not actually be a picture of you, or it might be taken in such a way that it does not actually resemble you as you look in person. And then you go to meet this person, and there is a disconnect between what they look like online or who they portrayed themselves to be online as you've been chatting versus the version of them that shows up in these moments. So we've got catfishing there, and then we've got black culture, black aesthetics, black identity. If we bring those words together, black fishing then becomes someone who is not black portraying themselves as being black, is how it's commonly been understood. In my article, I expanded a little bit beyond that to say, yes, that is certainly the root and history of blackfishing, people who either appear black or racially ambiguous and then are either being seen as black or are people know that they're not, and yet they kind of model these sorts of aesthetics. But in my article, I expand a little bit more to be more about a set of practices you can engage in rather than someone appearing black, which kind of pushes us more into the terrain of intentionality. Like, oh, did this person intend to style themselves this way? Did they intend to come across as black? Whereas I'm more interested in what are the consequences or the fallout when these practices are engaged with they could be engaged by creators, influencers, individual people, but they can also be engaged by celebrities, by companies, by brands as well. So my definition of blackfishing still operates on the same principle, where essentially you can engage in these appropriative tactics where you're still appropriating Black culture or Black identity or Black aesthetics in some capacity with more flexibility around the intent. For a brand or a company, it might be to tap into Black consumer markets. For a creator or influencer, it might be in service of growing their following or developing their personal brand. It might not always be about somebody who is trying to look Black or trying to come across as Black when they're not. I kind of wanted more of that flexibility. So that's how I think about blackfishing as a set of practices that anyone or any entity could engage in.
For sure. In Britain, there's a thing called mockney, which is where ruling class people who have voices like mine, accents like mine, adopt a Cockney accent, so working class Southeast London voice, in order to be more hip and more cool, even though nothing in the rest of their lives is akin to being proletarian. So I think there's an interesting element to that. Now, one of the things you do in your essay, which I hope lots of other people get to read, is to look at the bourgeois media's coverage of these controversies that have emerged over blackfishing. Can you, and Instagram in this case, can you tell us what it was like reading that coverage? What did you encounter?
Yes. So I suppose the first thing that comes to mind when I read the coverage, a lot of the coverage, it did include interviews with the creators who I actually write about in that article. So people like Emma Hallberg, some of these sources had actually gone to reached out to her through her social media platforms. And so a lot of the media discourse actually included these articles or quotes or snippets or bites from the same creators that I was actually, whose Instagram content I was looking at. So one of the first things that I noticed is something that in the article I called discourses of rationality. That's essentially just a way of saying, what is the line of logic they tell themselves for what they're doing? Because that's really what I found in the media discourse. A lot of it was framed around why? Why are they doing this? For me, I certainly had that question, but I had many others as well. The media discourse seemed to want to get to the bottom. They wanted an answer. Like, we've got to find a way to make sense of this. And so what I saw in the quotes and in these interviews in the media discourse, or people like M. Hallberg, who had been widely accused of blackfishing, or who widely people thought was actually black before it was revealed that she was not, and was accepting, brand deals from black-owned brands and things like that. What I saw in this media discourse was that for a lot of these creators, we can only go based on the words that they actually shared in those articles or, the quotes they actually volunteered. But it seemed that what came across is that it just felt so normal to them that it wasn't even something that they could name as a practice. They're like, well, I just want to look like Kim Kardashian. I just want to look like Ariana Grande. I think this is just a way to look beautiful. Yes, I wear shades of foundation that are darker than my own skin tone. I intentionally tan to get even darker in the summer. Yes, I style my hair in ways that look a little bit more racially ambiguous. Yes, I wear these kinds of clothing, but for a lot of them, what they fell back on, so to speak, is I'm mimicking celebrity culture, or I find these other women in public media beautiful, and I want to look like that. So it's also kind of interwoven in normative beauty standards, which are really heavily shaped by celebrities. Again, if we're thinking like Kim Kardashian is the name that kept coming up. That's one of the things that I noticed in the media discourse is just getting more into their mindset of, well, I just get really dark in the summer, or I just want to, this is my version of what I consider beautiful or attractive, or I want to look like this person. Or there were a couple of creators who had said, this is my way of honoring Black women. That is a little bit of a different piece if we're putting it kind of in conversation here about the extent to which they themselves believe that to be true. And there was a little bit of pushback in one of the articles I looked at that was like, please describe how you find this to be in service of Black women. And the logic there is almost similar to what the other creators had shared in terms of, I find this aesthetic beautiful. More people should be aware of this aesthetic. I'm kind of popularizing this aesthetic without the kind of reflexive mindfulness or awareness of the history that comes with it, the unique kind of sexism and racism and classism that are articulated together within this kind of context. So that was probably one of the most interesting things that when I had started choosing my media articles, I had anticipated that some of them would include interviews, but I was kind of surprised by the fact that so many of the articles I'd collected were really wanting to explore the why, as opposed to looking at what is the material fallout for Black women because of all of this. That was not nearly as present in the set of media articles or in the media discourse around blackfishing. Again, this particular case where Emma Hallberg and other creators, where we start seeing the word blackfishing pop up, is like 2018 to 2019, in terms of the year at which we're seeing it. So there's still in the United States in the intervening years, there's now more of a kind of cultural familiarity with terms like intersectionality or with criticism of kind of capitalist logics and how they disproportionately affect other groups of people. But just something I'm thinking of and like recalling the media discourse about it is not much is being said about what this means for Black women or Black creators, which actually led to one of my other projects in the intervening years. I've done a lot of research interviewing Black influencers, interviewing them in the wake of the George Floyd protests, interviewing them again now, a few years later, looking at, okay, what is it like to be you? What is it like to be a Black woman who's working as an influencer in this kind of digital terrain alongside influencers who are appropriating you and your aesthetics and how you look. What is it like to navigate these platforms to try and do this as work? What things disproportionately affect you as a Black creator that don't affect white creators in the same kind of way? So that's the turn my research took after blackfishing, which is partially a reflection of the fact that the media discourse had almost nothing to say about or no questions about what does this mean for Black creators, though.
Great. Are you going to write us a book about this?
Yes, I actually have a couple of other articles coming out from that research
Do you?
coming out
Okay.
soon that spotlight Black women influencers' experiences, their line of work, and what that's like. So, in
Wonderful.
progress.
I the last place I taught in the US was Tulane, so in
Mm,
New Orleans,
yeah.
a city that's still over 60% Black and a university that is 45% Jewish and generally Jewish white. So a real difference in what folks were up to. I found lectures there, Prof, really difficult because there would be maybe 3 boys and maybe 30 girls in every class. And the boys spent the whole time betting on sports, and the girls spent the whole time visiting influencers, right? So I thought, okay, I don't want to be an authoritarian scumbag in his 60s. Let's look at the political economy of influencing.
Hmm.
Right? So I tried to connect, there's this movement called Fuck You, Pay Me.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
I'm sorry, folks, if this language offends you, but it's pretty interesting in that it does give you a lot of data about the incredible sexism in terms of remuneration to influencers, where the vast majority of influencers are white women and the big money goes to men, right?
Hmm.
But I didn't get very far with it because you had to be a real influencer to get inside it all. Do you know what I mean? But I did as much research as I could in order to turn my lectures into something that was about influencers, thinking, I've got them. They're going to like this. It's real. It matters. They couldn't give a tuppenny piss, it doesn't matter. They still want to look at the influences on makeup and fashion. And having some old man at the front saying, this is how women are being exploited. These are the patterns that we can see financially, just didn't sing. When it came to writing essays, of course, they were brilliant. They knew the sort of thing that I wanted to hear. And I wonder whether when you're teaching this stuff, it might be easier for you to resonate with your students about influences than it was for me, that I was just too far away socioculturally and in gender terms as well from what was driving them. That's a really long-winded autobiographical style question, but do you know what I'm asking, Prof?
I think so. And I can at least speak to my own experiences in the classroom where just top of mind, I have a lot of students who come up to me usually after the first day or the first week and just say, you're the first Black professor I've ever had, or you're the first Black woman professor I've ever had. And I think about how that contrasts with my own experience. The first Black woman I ever had as a professor was in my doctoral program, and my last semester of coursework was the first time I ever had that happen for myself. So I have students who are already thinking about that. For many of the classes I teach, and at the university I currently teach at, which is the University of South Carolina, I teach in the School of Journalism and Mass Communications. I normally teach a lot of large lecture classes. So usually the large lecture classes of like 80 to 130 students is usually what I have. I'll occasionally have smaller ones at 30 or at 50 or so. But most of the time, for most of my classes, no matter what the subject is, I do find that my classes are largely white, largely women, or kind of the majority demographic, usually by a large margin, no matter what subject I'm teaching. Even in those circumstances, I have a lot of people come up, or I do have Black students, or I've had Asian students, or just so many other types of students, queer students come up and say, I've never seen someone like you be the person that's standing in front of a class. That you stand out here amongst the faculty. You stand out in terms of maybe they transferred from another institution and they never encountered a Black professor there. So I do think, as you kind of described, that there is this resonance that exists when I step into the room and when I step in as a Black woman and say, hey, I've spent years doing research with Black women, with, researching Black influencers and their experiences. And then when I have something to say, it kind of, my cultural competency is coming through, so to speak. And that's something that they appreciate, or my cultural currency, you could even frame it as that way, is something that is working or is effective with my students as well. That when I say, hey, here are the insights I found with Black women, or based on my interviews with Black influencers at a lot of levels. I have done interviews with Black influencers that have millions of followers. I've done interviews with Black influencers that maybe have 10,000 followers and that have just secured their very first brand sponsorship. So like a wide range as well. Usually they sit up a little bit more in the room, or if I'm just spotlighting my research kind of quickly to contextualize something we're doing in class, I do notice they seem a little bit more interested in, well, what did your research say? What did you find? What did these Black creators have to say? What did they have to say about AI and algorithms on the platform? What did they have to say about the fact that in the wake of the George Floyd protests in the United States in 2020 and going into 2021, what did they have to say about the sudden influx of white followers that they got, who suddenly were DMing them asking, hey, can you educate us about racial justice? When for a lot of these Black influencers, that was never a component of the content they created before. But they suddenly are being put in a position where they are, for Black women, hyper visible in these digital platforms. You have media discourse, which I also looked at the time and analyzed, that said, if you want to help Black communities right now, follow Black influencers as being one of the solutions, positioned as one of the tangible solutions to what you can do as an ally or to address racial strife, without any thought for what would it be like for the mostly Black women who suddenly have all of these white followers in a week in the wake of such horrible Black tragedy that has existed? If we're thinking about police brutality and just the horrible injustices and crimes committed against Black communities, that's been your experience your whole life. It's felt that no one has ever cared before. And now that media institutions are saying you should go follow Black influencers, where does that leave them? For some of them, as one quote kind of phrased it, it felt like she was capitalizing on Black tragedy. That people were going to her, viewing her content. She was getting higher engagement. She was getting more contacted by brands at a higher rate than she had been in the past. Uh, but for what? And also, notably, as I've done research beyond 2021 and more recently, a lot of these brand sponsorships have fallen off after 2021 or so, after, in quotes, the conversation moved on. What happens to the Black creators after that? That's a lot I've done. There's so much research I've done in the last few years that it's hard to choose what to say right now, but at least that's what's coming to mind right now as you and I are talking.
I understand. Really, this is multiplying Du Bois's double consciousness, isn't it? Where
Mm.
folks are always going to be indexical of something beyond them as individuals and expected to understand and to represent that in the multiple sense of representing, and becomes very, very difficult when that burden of expectation that's political, it's commercial, it's personal, is all, in a sense, landing upon you, not necessarily entirely of your own choice. So they're facing multiple contradictions. Prof, I have one more question for you, if I may.
Go ahead.
I wanted to ask, do you, and this sounds a little bit like, an evaluative interview of some kind, like, we're going to promote you if you give the right response. But in all seriousness, what's on the docket for you next, along with the fiction writing, the creative writing? Do you have a vision for a research project after the influences?
That's an excellent question and one that I've been thinking about for the last couple of years. I've kind of, in my field of media and communication studies, have become known as the influencer scholar, even though I would describe myself as a scholar of, other types of things. I've become known as the influencer person. So there is, just from the practical dimensions of, I currently have a tenure track position, working toward tenure, thinking about what does my, research agenda look like, my research profile. A lot of people know me as that. And I am in a position where I'm thinking, okay, there is a lot that I want to explore about influencing, and especially how it affects Black influencers and Black creators. Right now, I'm working on a project where I'm taking some of the data that I collected in 2021 and 2022 about Black influencers and kind of the mental and emotional toll. Just that context of the George Floyd protests and getting a lot of followers and a lot of brand deals that were specifically around like education or racial justice and things like that were the nature of the brand deals. Looking at that, and I'm gearing up to do another round of interviews. Like, okay, a few years removed from that, what is the mental and emotional state now? And the U.S. political climate in 2026. How has the rhetoric in the United States around, attacks on DEI, just horrible things against anyone who isn't white, kind of the rise of white supremacy, not the rise of, but we're seeing different kinds of public displays of white supremacy that's always existed right now. How is that impacting Black influencers and creators mentally and emotionally? I'm about to put those two pieces together to do a bit of a comparison. What was the mental and emotional toll like in 2020 and 2021 compared to 2026 for Black creators and influencers? That's what's immediately ahead of me. Beyond that, I have actually been thinking for a while that maybe I want to switch my trajectory a little bit and focus a bit less on influencing, even though I still find that so interesting and there's so much to learn and so like much can be gleaned by like really understanding how all of these different systems articulate together. I think that if I'm really honest with myself, which is what I'm trying to do now. I'm 31. I turned 30 about a year ago, and I find that that really changed my life in so many ways. It's so true. Everything my my mom and my Grammy always said about when you get older, when you turn 30, you priorities will shift. You will evolve again. You will become somebody new, and things will be different. Like all of that is true, and kind of in line with just my own personal journey. I've been thinking actually about shifting away from social media a little bit and looking more at Black creatives in music, in film. So less about social media influencing and more spotlighting Black creativity and also Black joy in other contexts, and kind of shifting maybe away from social media, which has kind of been my primary research focus since my grad school days.
Well, that's exciting. Thank you so much, Doc Stevens. It's been fantastic getting to know you a little bit, and your little pooch, who is still sleeping. Is Rosie still sleeping there on that lovely
She
chair?
is. Yes, she certainly is. I took her on a long walk before our podcast, so we came home and played for a while. And then we had a 15-minute period of having a little snack and settling back down before we began. So, yes, she is still sleeping, but I don't think that'll be true in a few minutes.
Perfect. Well, it's just been great chatting. Um,
It
and
has.
I'm really excited to read these new articles when they come out. And I really want to push you to smush them together and give us a book, right?
Yeah, yes, a lot of people have asked that. And right now I'm going the route of doing journal articles, but really I have so much data that I've collected. I've done so much research that there is plenty more to also do a book. I'm just handling one task at a time right now as a thing, but perhaps in the
Understood.
future. Yeah, it's been in the back of my mind.
Thanks again. It was wonderful talking.
Thank you. This was wonderful.